today we will have 3 speakers, and the first Wiebke she is also one of the EIWO researcher, will be presenting, and then Eszter Zólyomi from European Center will be presenting on gender differences in unpaid care, and finally Dorothea Schmidt-Klau will be presenting on continued inequality in late work. And each presentation will be 15 minutes. And after all these presentations, we will open the discussion for the audience. And we will have a discussion for including 3 talks, and the people attend our webinar. And today, I would like to also advertise our next webinar in 25th May, and it will be same time, and it will be on Swedish EU presidency and triple transition, green, digital, and demographic transition. And we will send this EIWO advertisement next webinar invitation to everyone who attends this webinar. And yeah, we can start with Wiebke's presentation now. Okay, you can share your screen.
I hope everyone can hear me and see the slides. Okay, thank you for your attention. First of all, I would like to apologize because my Wi-Fi signal is also a bit weak today, but I think it will be fine during the presentation. I'm Wiebke Schmitz. I'm working at the Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training in Germany, but I'm also still part of the EIWO team and EIWO project. And my presentation today is about the work that I have done, I think, in the last 2 years. And these are the research results where we analyze late working life trajectories and how they differ between men and women, and how they relate to family history and welfare regimes. And in my presentations, I always like to include this figure on the right, because it shows really well that there's still this assumption of 3 phases during the life course. So education, paid work, and retirement. So this is basically the normal working biography, which is also rewarded by most of, or I think all of the national contexts of welfare regimes, for example, by retirement benefits. But it doesn't really apply to women, because women are still expected to take care of the family, to do unpaid care work. So employment, we have to assume that employment is also shaped by family obligations. And not only that, we also expect that family obligations in the past have an impact up until late working life. So past discontinuities, like, for example, childbearing at the age of 25 or 30 among women, can cause less work experience, and which in turn can decrease their chances of getting a job, and which in turn further reduces their chances to get employed again. So we expect that there's an influence over the life course. So overall, we have to assume that this figure on the right isn't really up to date, and that women's late working life is much more diverse and is characterized by unpaid care work or part-time employment, whereas the late working life of men is probably more structured around full-time employment until they retire. But these choices, so the choice between paid and unpaid care work, is also shaped by societal norms and their reproduction via policies. So men and women have different opportunities presented to them, and these are also associated with welfare state policies, which still, so welfare regimes still assign care responsibilities to women. And so their social security institutions and policy still structure employment histories by rewarding continuous employment biographies. So women are more frequently disadvantaged. So there are different welfare regimes, and we grouped the countries in 5 different types of welfare regimes, which first of all is the social democratic regime, which is mostly found or only found among the Nordic European countries, for example, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And this regime basically supports flexible careers and the dual earner model, and also provides more public childcare. Whereas countries of the liberal regime much more strongly support market mechanisms or rely on market mechanisms to produce welfare, which in turn somehow encourage this division of care and paid work among or between men and women. Then we have the conservative and the southern regime. The conservative regime is found among countries or countries that are characterized by the conservative regimes are, for example, Germany, but also France and Austria. And they, compared to the other regimes, highly regulate working life by rewarding continuous working biographies. Whereas on the other hand, the southern regime, so for example, Greece, but also Spain or Italy, they are much more characterized by a lack of intervention, which also kind of produces this gender inequality. And both regimes basically leave women to shoulder care responsibilities. And lastly, the most difficult regimes of all of them is the post-socialist regime. Like for example, Poland, but also the Czech Republic. And this regime is really difficult to characterize because countries that are grouped in these regimes are still really diverse and heterogeneous. But overall, you can say that they are all somehow characterized by a high prevalence of female full-time employment and only short employment disruptions because of childcare. And in our results, we find 8 different types of employment histories among women in the European population from the age of 50 to 65. So you can see that each horizontal line, which are piled up in each of these employment types that you can see here. So each of these horizontal lines, they show the prevalence of employment histories from the age of 50 to 65. And as I said, we find that there are 8 different types of employment trajectories. So there are different types of women. So some women are spend more time in full-time employment, whereas others spend most of their late working life in part-time employment or in domestic work. So it's really important to distinguish types. But overall, we find that women's late working life is really diverse, and that's also that they also spend a large amount of years in domestic work. So they spend around 3 years in domestic work. And compared to men, you can see that here these we also find 8 different employment types, but they are not so different from each other. They mostly differ in the timing of the retirement, but they are mostly employed full-time. And they also spend almost twice as much time in full-time employment compared to women. And also compared to women, which is also really shocking or interesting, is that they spend almost no time in domestic work. So it's like 0.03 years that they spend in domestic work, which is almost nothing. So in the next step, we looked at how these employment types that I showed you before, how they can be explained or how they differ by the family history of men and women. And we find, overall, we find that women's employment is much more dependent upon family history or family obligations in the past. So if they had family obligations in the past, for example, when they had a partner and children, they are much more likely or much more frequently found in domestic work and part-time employment in later life. So you can really see in the data that if they had family obligations at the age of 20, 30, you can still see that there's an impact up until late working life. Whereas if you look at the group of men, you almost find no pattern, or you find that family obligation doesn't really explain their late life employment, or men's employment doesn't really depend on having family obligations or not. They are either way, they are full-time employed, which also supports the breadwinner caretaker division, because probably if men had family obligations, we assume that probably women took care of that. And on top of that, we find that the associations that I showed you before, that they also differ by different welfare regimes. So the degree to which family care obligations in the past have an impact on late life employment also depends on national policies, or here we looked at the depend on welfare regimes. So you can see in the figure that in southern and liberal regimes, there's a stronger impact of family obligations on employment. So you can see that women are more likely in domestic work and part-time employment if they had family obligation in the past, and less likely in full-time employment if they had family obligation in the past. So these associations between family obligations and the likelihood of being in domestic work or part-time employment and full-time employment is also dependent on the welfare regimes, and is mostly the association is most pronounced in liberal and southern regimes, which also makes sense because these regimes really support, or they don't really support women in combining paid and unpaid work. But in contrast, we also find that in social democratic regimes, women's employment is almost not affected by earlier family obligations, which also makes sense because in Nordic countries, women have more access to public childcare, for example, and you can really see that in the data that you really can see in the data that it makes a difference. And lastly, these are the results among men, and you can again see that there are differences by welfare regimes. But you can also again see that it's also like the opposite association compared to women. So men are more likely in full-time employment if they had family obligation in the past. And this is especially the case in regimes that don't support the dual earner model, which is the southern, the liberal, and the conservative regimes. So to summarize, our key findings are that, or they indicate that decisions in earlier life, so for example, the decision to exit from the labor market or to reduce working hours because of childcare obligations in the past, that they still have an impact on late working life. And this is especially so among women. Women are more likely in domestic work or part-time employment in late working life when they had to do childcare in the past. And among men, it's the opposite. So they are more likely in full-time employment. And that's probably the case, or we assume that this is because women did the childcare for them, which also supports the breadwinner caretaker division, or the idea of the breadwinner caretaker division. And the degree to which childcare obligations in earlier life lead to domestic work or part-time employment among women in later life also depends on national context or on national policies. So its degree is especially pronounced in southern and liberal regimes, which are those regimes that don't really support women in combining work and family obligations. So, and this is the last slide. Our recommendations are that the integration of women into the workforce is needed to enhance the aging workforce, and that the implementation of new policies should prevent gender inequality in earlier life. And because, as we can see in our results, that employment decisions in earlier life caused by family obligations in earlier life have an impact up until late working life. So policies or countries should implement life course-oriented policies. And also our findings highlight the importance of national policy regimes, because as we can see here, or as we saw in our results, is that women's opportunities are dependent on the national context, such as policies and societal norms that are associated with them. And yeah, thank you.
So you can see my screen and you can hear me too. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the organizers of the webinar for inviting me to talk here today. I think my presentation, which is titled Gender Equality and Unpaid Care Work in Later Working Life, is kind of very nicely fits into the previous presentation, kind of highlighting the importance of considering gender inequalities in unpaid care work as an important step towards moving towards greater gender equality in general. And so I will zoom into gender gaps and inequalities in unpaid care, also often referred to as the so-called second shift. And also partly accounting for the fact that it's mainly women who bear this kind of often referred as a double burden of balancing in between, paid and unpaid work obligations. So in the late 1980s, Hochschild described this process when, women have entered the kind of first shift of the workforce. But this has resulted in, surprisingly, let's say, meager change in the family and domestic sphere, the so-called second shift. So while over years in the last decades, we witnessed, significant improvements in women's participation in education and in the labor force, gender equality in unpaid work has been lagging behind, which also kind of led to some scholars to talk of a stalled or at the very least a kind of very uneven gender revolution. And within, talking of unpaid work, which includes different types of activities, unpaid labor activities, gender equality, inequality in unpaid care work has been, in particular highlighted as kind of a missing link in the analysis and, in understanding, existing gender inequalities in labor outcomes. So in linking unpaid care and employment outcomes, time use surveys have been particularly useful to assess how gender gaps in unpaid work responsibilities and care in particular translate into gender inequalities in labor force participation, mainly because they're able to capture this time distribution within a given household. And what the results from these surveys consistently show is that the amount of time spent on unpaid work, care work, is negatively correlated with female labor force participation. And also when the distribution between women and men in terms of unpaid care responsibilities is more unequal, this has more detrimental effects on the employment situation of women relative to men's. And in the previous presentation was very nice because it exactly showed this kind of importance of taking earlier life experiences and how they impact on labor outcomes later in life. And yeah, so it was a really nice example of this kind of looking into this association between how family and employment trajectories evolve and how these kind of effects then result in different ways, not just between men and women, but also within men with different and women with different characteristics. Now, within the context of unpaid work and unpaid care work, there have been relatively little attention paid to informal caregiving to older people. And despite the fact that these are the type of activities that generally typically take place at a time in late midlife when individuals are also involved in other forms of intergenerational caregiving like childcare or grandparenting, and which has also very important implications for the gender inequalities we observe in late working life, partly because of this kind of balancing between unpaid and paid labor. And what we can see in this graph is trends in the prevalence of informal caregiving to older person, and these mainly older parents or in-laws or other older relatives among women and men aged 50 and 64. As I mentioned, this is a kind of sandwich period in the life course, in the life cycle. And what we see that significant gender inequalities exist in informal caregiving, with women predominantly providing care. Although, for instance, in the case of the Nordic cluster with the red line, but also to some extent in the continental European region, the blue line, we see also some evidence of men increasingly taking up on caregiving activities. Now, we also know that these observed gender differences and patterns in informal caregiving are shaped by context, demographic, societal policy changes, like mentioned increased female employment, increases in retirement age, the provision of changes in the provision of care services and so forth, just to name a few. And of course, these also should be taken into account, which kind of what provided the motivation for our study to track caregiving trajectories across subsequent cohorts of men and women in terms of caregiving, informal caregiving, and to see if and to what extent this evolution in the gender care gap in informal caregiving is due to changes in informal caregiving by women or men or both. And if this gender gap in informal caregiving evolved differently across different regions and care regimes in Europe. And here you can see our data and the methods that we used. Now, I may not go into detail here, but if there are any questions later on, I'm happy to answer. So I would rather focus on on our findings and the results that we had. So I know that this might be not so easy to kind of decipher this graph at the first glance, but basically there are two things that we see here. First, what we see is that the prevalence of caregiving declines with age. After the age of 50, in particular for both men and women, and this decline is measured by the slope, or this inclination of caregiving trajectories depicted in this figure, which kind of produces a convergence of the gender care gap with age, as later men enter at later ages, become more likely to start providing informal care. So this would be an age effect, the age effect over the life course. Now, secondly, what we see is that the prevalence of caregiving for similar age ranges, like you see the lines, the dotted lines are for women, is identical. It's almost identical when you look at this, particularly this overlapping, where these lines are overlapping. Which basically what tells us is this kind of pattern is so stable that there is no cohort effect. So we cannot see any cohort effect here. Now for men, the straight lines, again, we see a decrease over age. So it's kind of similar, more similar. But when we look at, again, the overlapping lines, what we see is that the prevalence of caregiving among men is kind of this decrease is placed progressively lower for later born cohorts of men. So this results in basically a widening of the gender care gap among later born cohorts of women and men due to this lower probability of men of providing informal care over time. Another kind of could be a number of explanations, kind of what could explain these patterns that we see. And one could be linked to increases in statutory retirement age. I'm talking about the pattern for men. So meaning the postponement of age by men at which they shift their time to unpaid caregiving activities. Now, the interesting thing is that we don't find the same pattern for women, which kind of indicates that policies that are aimed at increasing female labor market participation, such as increased pension age that I mentioned here as an example, appears to have not significantly reduced women's caregiving around retirement age, which also kind of puts women at a greater risk of reducing their labor supply in order to kind of manage at this time of the period to manage meeting caring responsibilities. Now, our analysis also, carried out this analysis also separately across, to track these changes across three different care regimes, the continental, which you can see on the top, the southern care regime in the middle, and the northern care regime in the bottom. And we see a kind of, there is in the continental Europe, there is a kind of widening due to women's, the pattern for women, widening of the gap. In Southern Europe, we see a reduction in this of caregiving, providing care. And the kind of the gaps are very visible also, that there are very large differences that are remaining in this group of countries. And the Nordic countries, where we see a narrowing of very clear narrowing of the gender gap. Now, kind of what our results mean in terms of policy implications. I mean, in addition to the need to obviously encourage and promote taking up care by men, I think our results also kind of raise this issue of whether policies aimed at the full-time employment of women and the prolongation of working life really sufficiently account for this second shift that I just mentioned. The fact that women's, this unpaid care work that is still carried out by women in their kind of what is called, in core years of adulthood. I mean, in addition to labor market and adjustment to labor market and maybe retirement policies, policy focus should also be on addressing, challenges in terms of availability of formal care and support services and more gender equal policies. And I kind of put here the Nordic, so the northern cluster of countries, where we find the least gender difference in the prevalence of caring and also a narrowing of the gender care gap over time. Kind of could be considered as like a beacon of hope, kind of illustrating that, where political will is consistently implemented in relevant policies, and where gender equality is also regarded as, as a social goal itself, kind of reducing this gap in unpaid care work and kind of fastening this convergence between unpaid and paid labor is possible. So yeah, Nordic region is beacon of hope. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. It was very striking to see this widening the gap for later cohorts, because one would expect opposite. So it was really interesting. And but now we are moving on to our final presentation from Dorothea Schmidt-Klau, and she will be focusing on more general inequalities and also different dimensions such as gender pension gap and pay gap. So you can welcome to start.
So first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting seminar, and it's good to see that the messages that I will pass on from the perspective of the International Labour Organization fit so well in the research findings that were just presented. I will try to, let me just see whether I can actually scroll down. Yes, I can. What I will talk about today, I focus on two things. One thing is setting the scene, because I'm actually convinced that the numbers that I'm going to present give us a better feeling about the importance of the issue we are actually discussing about. But I will also try to get into some of the policy recommendations and policy entry points that will be needed to actually change the situation. In terms of setting the scene, I think actually, we talk about the drivers of change for the future of work, and the pure labor market numbers actually indicate that the demographic shifts in aging societies actually have a much huger impact on labor supply and labor markets in general than any of the other drivers yet. So it has a bigger impact than digitalization, it has a bigger impact than greening, has a bigger impact than globalization. That's for the time being, but still, I mean, for the time being, it's surprising that despite this influence, it's not a much discussed topic. I mean, it's much less discussed than digitalization or globalization or whatsoever. So I just want to also stress what I just said by some of the most stunning facts, at least I find them very stunning. I mean, just imagine a person born today in Europe has a 50% chance to become 100 years old. And women have still a higher life expectancy than men. So you can imagine what that means for societies in the future if half of the kids born today will become 100 years or even older. The longevity has doubled since 1900, which is the fastest change ever. And I just want to give you one example. When the pension system was introduced in Germany in 1889, the life expectancy was just above 40 years. So hardly anybody who paid into the pension system ever got anything out because the people died before. Now the life expectancy in Germany is over 80. So you can imagine the burden on pension systems, because now people are actually taking their pensions and they are taking them for longer and longer periods. The old age population will grow by over 300% over the course of this century by comparison to the working age population, which will grow by less than 50%. Developing countries will age, and this is true, most rapidly. The less developed countries will see their older population rise by nearly 350%. Developed countries are likely to see more subdued growth in their older age population, rising by roughly 70%. But of course, they are already much older. So that's why they are growing less older, but 350% for the less developed countries. And the population aging is happening more quickly than in the past. For example, in France, it took 150 years to move from a share of older people of 10% to a share of 20%. For Brazil, China, or India, it will take less than 20 years. Now, if we look at the labor force composition, and I'm not going to go into detail because this graph actually has tons of information. I guess we will share the presentations and you can have a look at it. But it's just clear from just quickly looking at this graph that across developing, emerging, and developed countries, the labor force is getting older. And the labor force participation rates are higher for men than for women, although the biggest difference you can actually see in emerging economies. One can also observe that there is a growing number of older workers in the labor force, again, across all income groups. This trend, the fact that women's labor force participation rate will continue to be much lower has, of course, considerable implications for women's welfare later in when they are not working anymore. And the fact that we, for example, see here in the developing countries that the differences are less stunning than in other countries. So the labor force is actually almost equal of women compared to men. That's simply due to the fact that here women have to work to survive. That's why they participate in labor markets, but the quality of the jobs where they're in is much lower than for men. The labor force, the decrease in labor force participation rate in developing countries, and that's what this graph shows here, can be attributed to the advances made in terms of pension systems coverage and other social transfer systems, which gives some older people a choice in deciding whether they remain in the labor force or whether they quit the labor force. And the increase in labor force participation rates in developed economies, on the other side, actually is the result of increased retirement age, but it's also partially the result of people wanting to work longer. So the systems that actually show this flexibility, they also do see an increase. We do see that the gender gaps in labor force participation rates are high across all levels of development, reflecting, amongst many other things, the persistence of occupational and sectoral gender segregation and the uneven distribution of unpaid household and care work, even at older ages. Now, what are the economic consequences of aging? And that's really the question we need to ask ourselves. So maybe the biggest is, of course, the changes in labor supply, because it's not the majority of countries or people that can rely on pensions. They actually need to work longer. They need to be given the chance to work longer, and that will have a huge impact on the labor supply. There will also be a huge impact on the composition of the labor supply. So the typical jobs that usually are done by younger people, I mean, there will be less young people to do these jobs. On the other side, there will be a lot of older people, and we need to make sure that these older people can actually do the jobs that before have been done by younger people. There's also a change in dependency ratios. I'll show you a slide on this one. And here there is a clear gender problem, because if you take advanced dependency ratios that take into account that being in the labor force does not automatically mean that you're not dependent, because if you have a bad job, you still might be dependent on the system or on other people. That's, of course, a reality for many more women than men. The aging consequences are also huge in terms of consumption. I'll talk about this in a second, but the fact is, because women are economically less strong in terms of income and in terms of property, etc., the changes in the consumption patterns are actually dominated by the needs for men, because they have the resources, so they dominate. So this change in consumption patterns is not gender neutral, and that's something very important to look at. And we also see the changes in transitions. And of course, that's what we've heard in the previous presentations. The fact that women are not making the same amount of money throughout their labor force life has an impact, and we see a much higher rate of female poverty across the globe at old age compared to others. So all of these economic changes, they are important, but they all of them have a negative gender focus. They are not gender neutral. Now, I'm not going to look at all these graphs. I just want to show you the one in the blue box, which is actually just the labor force participation rates of the older age group. And the reason why I want to show you is that change can happen, okay? I mean, look at an example like, for example, Germany. It was the labor force participation rate for the older age group was relatively low, just above 40%, and it increased to above 70%. So this is the policy range we have, and these are the countries where we have to look at and see what did they actually do in terms of changing the labor force participation rate of this older group. This is just a picture of the old age dependency ratio, and you clearly see, like in sub-Saharan Africa, there is no old age dependency problem because there are no older people. I mean, it's hard as it is, and there are more younger people coming. So the dependency ratio, old age dependency ratio actually stays flat. Having said that, if you would take into account other factors like the quality of job, it would actually look very different, this graph. But you also see that in other countries, the dependency ratio has been increasing tremendously. Now, I was talking about the consumption, and this weird wheel you see on the top right, it's actually from the World Economic Forum, and it gives all the impact factors on future consumption. And aging is just one of them, but it definitely is one. So it's very difficult to actually say how the consumption patterns will change. But we know for sure, simply because of the aging, there will be an increased demand in services compared to manufacturing products. Older people consume more services, and especially one service, and that's the long-term care services. And so here we have something which on the one side, it's a very good thing because 90% of the long-term care workers are women. So if all these long-term care workers were formal long-term care workers, this would be the potential for women to actually get jobs throughout their working life, not just at older age. But the problem is, of course, given the quality of the jobs in the care sector right now and the fact that most of the care is actually unpaid, it's not a chance. It becomes even, again, a double burden, as we have heard, even at older age. And then the change in transitions, I mean, you just have a quick look at these graphs. These are all countries where we, I mean, it's advanced countries, it's not low-income countries. And in every single one, with very few exceptions, you see that the risk of women to be poor after the age of 65, it's much higher than for men. We have heard about the gender pay gap. Here are just some numbers of the gender pay gap that we have seen in our recent reports. The important thing is the gender pay gap actually stays very stable. We don't see a lot of progress in the world. It's around 20% according to the Global Wage Report from 2018-19. 2%, that's the lowest, 22%, that's the highest, but still you see that, the gender pay gap is a reality. And the gender pay gap persists over the life course. It actually increases over time. So the older you are, the bigger the gender pay gap. And the gender pay gap makes women more vulnerable to shocks. And of course, if they are facing an economic shock or another shock, they are just not as well protected, which then has implications for their further work life and has implications for their further life when they stop working. And here are some of the reasons, the causes why we see this difference. And as a matter of fact, these causes really, they start from the cradle. And they go throughout the work life, and we have heard about some of them, so I'm not going to go into details. But the important thing is, and that was said before as well, it's this life course approach. It all starts at early age. It actually starts when the kids are born and the way they are treated, and it starts from the education side up to the very end. So the transition to retirement, we've heard that as well. Of course, there is a trade-off between flexibility versus security. And for example, the significant gender difference in part-time work, for example, during the pandemic, part-time work became increasingly female, older, and more educated. So part-time work became an option, but of course, it's an option that is flexible, but at the same time, it lacks security. So this graph just shows, the dominance of female part-time work compared to full-time work, but we've heard about this as well. This is the retirement age gap, the pension gap, and you clearly see that there are remarkable differences between countries. So in countries like Japan and Mexico, you see a relative difference of almost 50%, 40–50%. In Estonia, it's relatively little, but even there is a bit of a difference. So this is what we just said, the injustice or the inequality from the work life translates into the pension life. And on top, it's not just that, the amount those protected have is different and much lower for women than for men, but it's also that fewer women actually profit from pension schemes. So it's 42% of those who get a pension are women compared to 49.6% men. Now, the policy entry points is, of course, well, if we say there's a change, we need to increase the labor supply. We need to see the policies that actually make that happen. We see that active aging is something that we need to support by policies. We also need to, and that's a general point, fight against ageism. And as we said, we have to actually look into policies that look at the life course and not just at the retirement moment, because then it's too late, it's far too late. You're not going to be successful in anything. And again, all these policy entry points, they have a female side to it. So all these policies, when well designed, they work to make older people less vulnerable. They work to keep them in the workforce. They work to keep them healthy. They work to not to reduce discrimination against older people, but they don't automatically work for women. So what we need is actually to take everything that works for women in labor markets, and we need to combine it with everything that works for older people. So that's a very important point, and that's not what we see. So this is what I see, and the policy recommendations, they include, of course, the need for equal opportunities for women and men, as I said, from the cradle, not just before retirement age. It needs targeted policies to less linear work life. So we have to take into account that this male-dominated three-stage model is not the reality anymore, and certainly not the reality for women. Lifelong learning plays an extreme role. We see that in terms of education, we have seen a lot of progress for women, and we see many countries actually where the education, the primary education, is getting to an equal level. But then we also see that in terms of lifelong learning, women just stop learning at a very early, well, normally when they have their first children. And this, of course, gives them a disadvantage in the later work life that is tremendous. We need to strengthen the social protection and income security. And this, of course, includes pension credits for care work, for unpaid care work. That's very important. And we see that these policies work. Policies to support new working patterns and active aging are needed, but again, with a female focus. The fight against ageism, that's very important, because actually you see a lot of, a lot of men report that they are discriminated when they get older, but women report it even more. It's a tremendous difference between women and men. And policies need to keep in mind that the other mega drivers, like, for example, digitalization, decarbonization, globalization, because all these areas are, again, not gender sensitive and not gender neutral. For example, this digitalization, it's actually very much discriminating against women. So is the greening of economies for the time being, and also globalization processes have shown the same pattern. So you need to see the demographic policies in combination with these other policies to, at the end, have a positive impact on what is happening. So this was just a quick overview of our standpoint in terms of aging societies. And I just hope that I got the message across that even if we have the best aging policies in the world in place, it does not automatically help women. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's a great message for ending the presentations, because it emphasizes life course policies are so important for the gender gap, and also overall lifelong life policies, working life policies, that increased participation doesn't necessarily decrease the gap between genders. So I think it was very important to think about this. And now, after this great presentations, we can start the discussion with the audience, and we can start with your questions to our presenters. While maybe you're elaborating your questions, I have actually one question, one general question to maybe three of our presenters can reflect on it, because when I was listening to presentations, all presentation focused on inequalities that's starting from mid ages and life course, and it's not just starting late working life. So I was wondering if the inequalities, this participation gap and unpaid care gap and this pension gap starts from early 50s or even middle ages, and then that's make the differences between countries, or this is even more when we come to age of 60s and late 60s. So is this gender inequalities based on the middle age groups between countries, or just start with late working life? For example, in Wiebke's presentation, we see these trajectories. It was very nice. So do you think Wiebke started from already in early 50s, these different trajectories, or this is more divergent when we come to 60s and late 60s?
Maybe if, I mean, it starts early and it gets worse. I mean, that's what I would say. So it's a phenomenon that starts, as you said, maybe even earlier, but then it gets stronger and stronger. The multiplier effects, the negative multiplier effects that you see in career paths of women actually get more pronounced towards the end. Now, there is one thing which all our labor market data does actually not show, or not show so clearly. It's that because of all that, women tend to just quit labor markets, because especially at the older age, they don't find any opportunities anymore. So they just simply completely quit. They don't even look for work anymore. And that, of course, adds again to their precarious situation when they get older. So the entire labor force, and that's what we saw, is much smaller for women and gets even smaller over time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe I can just add that, yeah, exactly as was just said before, that these differences accumulate. And I think the important thing also, and Wiebke's presentation actually showed this, that yeah, you have a great diversity there. So saying that everything gets more negative for everybody obviously is not the case. So you have these differences. It's very important where you start from, but socioeconomic inequalities are also explaining a lot in terms of how these trajectories work out in the end. So yeah, I would think that some policies, as it's work for some women and don't work for others, and that's why it's very important to account for these kind of differences that we observe in terms of not just paid employment but also in unpaid work. So I think it's important to not to overgeneralize, and yeah, there are great inequalities within groups of women and men, and that's the difficulty of kind of how to configure policies that more targeted, but at the same time are also universally enough in some other sense. Yeah, that's kind of, I think it's important to account for these differences as well when we talk about how these employment or family or other trajectories over the life course.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious because one of other studies that we have in EIWO, even though Sweden has one of the countries who has lower inequality between genders, but when we look at different education groups, most of the primary educated group already exit before coming to 60. So it starts way before, and then this gap never closes. So that I was wondering what's your reflections, but thank you so much. And now I see a comment, and I think this is a question for all presenters. It's a general question, and it says, what kind of anti-aging policies do you consider as the most effective? Do you consider as the most effective? Maybe you can recall some institutional cases. Would you like to comment on this? It's asked for. I think.
Maybe I can start again. Sorry. I mean, again, as was just said, it all depends. But one thing that we, from our experience, see, and we see this in the area of aging policies, and we see it in the area of gender policies. And we actually see the same in the area of youth policies. And that's that you need to have the whole set of policy interventions. You can have one enterprise with a fantastic aging policy with, for example, mixed age groups and mentoring programs, young to old and old to young. You can have fantastic occupational safety and health measures within an enterprise, and very good flexible work time arrangements, which is something older people actually ask a lot for. But then if this is just one enterprise in a country, it doesn't really help. So at the same time, you really need to see at the macro level, you need to have an eye on what impact does your investment in certain sectors have on the different groups. And if you can see, and many countries can see it, that older people are the group to actually watch out for, because especially women in this age group tend to end up in poverty, then you need to see which sectors are we going to invest in, which are the gender sensitive sectors, which are the sectors that actually can or need the older workers. Now this then needs to come with a set of skills policies, because just needing older people to do a certain job doesn't mean that these older people can do the job. So, I mean, all these little things at the micro, at the meso, at the macro level, you need to have them all coming together to really have a sustainable impact. And for each of the levels, we have tons of good examples and tons of things that work. But if not done in conjunction, you risk that it's just a drop and in the ocean, and it works for a little while, but then it's done, and it's kind of a lost investment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would you like to comment on Wiebke and Eszter?
I mean, I'm not a policy expert, but maybe another problem is that women are always working in these gendered jobs. So they also like do work at service jobs, workers, or care workers in, I don't know, at the hospital. And these are jobs that are also really badly paid. And this also contributes to income inequality and also poverty in old age. And this is also something, they also have less security, and they are also more easily, so because the jobs are less secure, they also more easily or are more likely to exit these jobs, because they are always trying to find jobs that they can combine with family obligations. And so overall, I think it's really important that policymakers understand that they have to, or they shouldn't distinguish between paid and care work anymore, because up until now they only reward, or they only only kind of reward normal working biographies, and that's really a problem. So they really have to think about how can they implement policies that thinks about both, or like combines, how can people work and combine paid work, for example. And I think at the moment there's a discussion on, or what I'm reading at the moment a lot is that there's this idea that, for example, people should work 4 days a week instead of 5 times a week, and that kind of a new idea on how people can combine care with unpaid work with paid work. And that's also something that I'm always thinking about as a solution, but again, I'm not a policy expert.
Thank you so much, Wiebke.
Yeah, maybe in relation to unpaid care, particularly for older, provided to older person. I mean, I already hinted it in my conclusions that, I mean, it's obviously an investment by, the state, to what extent you want to ensure that you have available and good quality formal care services, because it has really a crucial role in terms of helping women more, becoming more engaged in paid gainful employment. But I also see the need to more generic gender equality policies, as Wiebke mentioned in the presentation and the recommendations. Because I think these policies that you have, I mean, there is this kind of policy feedback effect in terms of how also, you know, norms related to gender and roles, according, you know, whether it's more, you know, suited to do something for women than for men, are shaped by policies. So it takes a bit longer, and maybe it cuts through, you know, you need to have different, you know, more generations. So progress is kind of slow. But I think that would be very important, just to have also policies more targeting also when it comes to old age care, men, and uptake of more care by men. Because I think choice is also something you have to consider. So some older people may prefer to have, you know, care by a relative. So you can't, you know, sometimes that's not so easy always, because care always has this relational aspect as well. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, investment in terms of formal care services, which, yeah, requires obviously that you spend more in this area. Also what was mentioned in terms of formalizing informal care to attract more women in this sector to be employed, although, yeah, it has this kind of downside of being quite, you know, poorly paid. And it would just, you know, maybe recreate again gender inequalities there. So I mean, I also don't have very particular, you know, like the policy that should be implemented, but we have already examples from countries, yeah, which could be, you know, shared and I think in terms of care, the EU has definitely put much more focus with publishing the European Care Strategy. And that, I think, is a very important, long overdue, probably. But so I see this here, the role also in terms of, you know, seeing what policies have been implemented in some countries, how they work, and kind of to learn from these. But yeah, it's an ongoing process, obviously.
Thank you so much. And are there any more questions and comments? I see no comments or hands right now. And we are also come to the end time of our webinar. Thank you so much for all presenters for their great presentations, and also for all participants. I think the main common message from all three presentations is that we see life courses so important, and its inequality starts from early stages, and we should have diverse policies for different cases and gender specific policies. And we will publish our webinar recording in our webpage, and also we will send around our advertisement for next webinar as well as the recording. And if you have any more questions or comments that you would like to share, you can always contact us, and we would like to forward to our presenters. Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.